Hello, everybody. We are the students of Willy Brandt School, and welcome to our podcast through the lens of the UN. In a short while, you will listen to the most pressuring issues around the world from the United Nations perspective.
Hello, and welcome to the third episode of our podcast, Through the Lens, exploring global issues through the lens of the United Nations. My name is Marissa Gilwald.
And my name is Sajid Targandeval.
And together we will be exploring and analyzing the topic of racism and xenophobia through the context of the United Nations. As a disclaimer, the topics and events we will discuss may be triggering and/or polarizing, and we wish to express that through our discussion and our analysis. We stand with those who have been discriminated against due to their race, religion, or beliefs. The examples and situations we will discuss are also the product of pre-existing systemic racism and discrimination, and the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a platform for further abuses and conspiracy theories to grow. The aim of this podcast is to analyze the United Nations' role to combat contemporary forms of racism, xenophobia, the glorification of Nazism, and the resolutions and programs the body has put out in this regard. Furthermore, we will explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated or exposed the need for action in the fight against racism, especially since 2021 is the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee or a nice beverage, or pop your headphones in for a run, and we hope that you enjoy the episode. Combating racism in all of its forms has been a topic in the United Nations since its establishment in 1945. It held its first World Conference Against Racism in Geneva, Switzerland in 1978, and focused many of its early efforts on the eradication of apartheid in South Africa.
Since then, the conferences have been held in 1983, 2001, and 2009. At the conference in 2001, the United Nations convened and established the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which is, as the UN defines, a comprehensive action-oriented document that proposed concrete measures to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The negotiations and establishment of this declaration, however, stirred up controversy amongst the United Nations community, though.
Yes, and the Durban Declaration of Action has been both a widely accepted and widely rejected document and program of action within the United Nations. This shows just how polarizing and controversial these topics can be and how tricky it can be to navigate within an international global body such as the United Nations. When the draft document was first publicized, it drew heavy criticism from the United States, Israel, and EU countries for its definition of Zionism as a form of racism.
And it's very important to note that the United Nations had formally defined Zionism through Resolution 3379, passed in 1975. The resolution was later revoked in 1991. However, it shows that the topic and debate surrounding Zionism has been prevalent in the United Nations for quite some time.
That's right. And when the Durban Declaration defined Zionism as a contemporary form of racism, many countries then boycotted not only the declaration, the document itself, but also the World Conference Against Racism ever since. It's important to note as well that the language was removed from the final version of the declaration. However, by that time, the damage was already done. The United States released a statement explaining its continued rejection of the declaration in November 2020. And it states that while the United States fully stands against racism and racial discrimination in all of its forms, it cannot support the resolution due to the rift that it causes between the UN nations. And another point of controversy within the document was the call for individual reparations from countries responsible for slavery from many African countries. This language was also eventually taken out of the declaration, but the general call for reparations still exists, prompting the boycotting states to remain against the resolution at large.
But while the Durban Declaration has been controversial over the past 2 decades, the United Nations does have other organs and bodies that help in its program to fight racism. The most comprehensive and important of which being the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination, CERD, both of which were established in 1969 and have nearly unanimous acceptance. 182 countries are state parties and 3 are signatories, which is 93% of UN members. The CERD serves as the monitoring body for the convention and requires its members to submit reports every 2 years regarding the steps they have taken towards the articles of the convention. These reports, however, are routinely late or not submitted by countries. The United States, for example, hasn't submitted its 2017 report, but while the spotty reporting has been a repetitive stain on the CERD, it could also be seen as the benefit because it pushes countries to evaluate their policies and curate anti racist policies.
And so the two resolutions that deal with the combat of racism being looked at in this podcast are a global call for the concrete action for the elimination of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and the comprehensive implementation of and follow up to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, or Resolution 75 237. And the other one is the combating the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, or Resolution 75-169. Both of these resolutions are yearly resolutions, with the majority of member states voting yes to both of them. And so both of these resolutions, as mentioned earlier, while usually passed without any fanfare each year, also draw a level of controversy. The former mainly because of the Durban Declaration, which causes 44 countries to abstain from voting, but the latter for other reasons. When the resolution was first introduced to the UN General Assembly in 2014, it was introduced by the Russian Federation, and some countries expressed concerns that the resolution was being used under false pretenses to distract from the human rights and disinformation abuses allegedly committed by the Russian Federation. The two countries to express their concerns widely being the United States and Ukraine. The resolution also calls for countries to restrict the spread of neo-Nazism and shut down safe havens for neo-Nazism and Nazism, both physically and online. The United States and other countries with free speech provisions within their constitutions cannot sign on to the resolution as it would violate free speech. And so some countries, especially Germany, Israel, and countries within the EU, also abstain from the resolution, giving their history and close relationship with the dark history of Nazism.
So, as we see clearly, the UN has a long history in combating racism and has done its due diligence in prompting nations to curate anti racist policy. But how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected these efforts? What are the next steps for the United Nations given the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration?
And in our next section, we will provide examples and analysis in the fight against racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. So stay with us as we continue to discuss this very important topic. The COVID-19 pandemic that has swept the world and is changing the way we operate has also brought with it a new wave of racism, xenophobia, and the rise in hate crimes against groups such as Asians, the Jewish population, and many more. In the United States, the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism found that while hate crimes dropped by 6% overall in 2020 in America's largest cities such as New York or Houston or Washington, D.C., anti-Asian hate was up by 145%. The largest spike was seen in New York City, with a 833% increase in reported AAPI hate crimes, which is Asian American Pacific Islander. Furthermore, Humboldt University, Freie Universität, and the German Center for Migration and Integration Research carried out a study in Germany with around 700 participants who identified as either Asian or those with Asian migration history. And in the survey, 50% of the respondents reported experiencing racism during the pandemic, of which 11% reported physical assault. The most common form of attacks were nonverbal, facial expressions or gestures, and verbal attacks, which occurred most frequently on the streets or on public transportation. And bear in mind that these statistics only account for those hate crimes reported and cannot account for the uptick in discriminatory and prejudiced behavior towards these groups, such as pulling their masks down, coughing, or spitting in their faces. And the motivation to not report or come forward is largely due to a variety of reasons, including fear, vulnerable immigration status, and fear of further retribution or hate crimes towards them, their families, or their communities.
Thank you, Marisa, for giving some very important examples about the US. As you mentioned, there are many cases which are not even recorded or reported for various reasons. The UN Special Reporter on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Tendai Ahiyum, wrote a report detailing racist incidents and new challenges during the COVID 19 pandemic in different countries in her report. The report provides examples of racist incidents not only against one race but multiple races. Based on the examples given in the report, it is apparent that COVID 19 played a role in the increase of anti Semitic incidents, anti Asian and anti Black racism, Islamophobia, and attacks on non nationals. As the virus started to spread rapidly, the Community of Security Trust in the UK and Northern Ireland reported the explosion of anti Semitic conspiracy theories that was spread over the internet, particularly social media. Many people fall into the trap of what is posted on social media, especially during the pandemic. I know of some very open minded friends who believed in different conspiracy theories about COVID and fell victim to these trains of thought. These conspiracy campaigns, without any doubt, create some sort of hatred towards a group which might lead to violence. For example, the Jacob Blaustein Institute reported that anti Semitic expression and violence has increased in over 20 countries between the month of April and October 2020 during the first wave of COVID 19. In addition to that, during the pandemic, Zoom bombing has been taking place where the virtual synagogue services have been attacked by racists to spread hate and anti Semitic abuse.
And that's an interesting challenge for the UN to tackle in this day and age, and due to the pandemic. As a result of digitalization and the widespread use of the internet, racist rhetoric and attacks can now happen wherever you are. And I'm sure the UN will need to take this into consideration as it debates the topic of digitalization and data privacy, as we discussed in our first episode.
That's very right, and systematic racism was always there. But COVID 19 really presented an opportunity for all the people who are against different races to attack them without being noticed when it comes to online attacks. What made these Zoom bombings easier is that, due to COVID 19, almost all forms of social and religious gatherings were held online, and it opened up the possibility for many audiences from different parts of the world to take part in an event. This made it easier and more accessible for racists to hide their identity and disturb or attack an event, which would be way harder to do the same while being physically in the event.
And unfortunately, those attacks were not only limited to social media or Zoom conferences. The fact is that many physical incidents of racist, xenophobic violence have continued to increase by ethno nationalist groups such as neo Nazis, skinheads, and members of other right wing groups that are against groups such as Asians or Muslims, Jewish population, Roma, LGBTQ plus persons, migrants, refugees, foreign students, people of color, and other minority groups.
Exactly. Many human rights reports and news articles have reported about the ongoing discrimination and harassment not only online but also physical assault against persons of Chinese or Asian descent. As we mentioned earlier, there was an increase of 833% in hate crimes against Asian Americans or those of Asian descent in New York City alone. Unfortunately, those in power play a major role in normalizing such kind of xenophobic and racist attacks or harassment. For example, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, used phrases such as Chinese flu or Wuhan flu many times on televisions while referring to COVID 19. This sort of rhetoric can fuel the fire and indirectly encourage individuals to act out against these groups violently. The Center for Public Integrity found in a study that about 3 out of 10 Americans blamed China or Chinese people for COVID 19.
And unfortunately, we won't know people's true motivations or what caused them to act in such a violent and xenophobic manner. In the United States, there were multiple violent incidents of attacks against Asian Americans or those of Asian descent. A man in Texas stabbed 3 Burmese family members, 2 of which being children, in a store right in the onset of the pandemic in March 2020, which he justified by blaming them for the virus. Similarly, in Canada, there were also numerous racism-fueled attacks, including a man stabbed who worked for the Republic of Korea on the justification that they, quote unquote, caused the pandemic. And as we discussed earlier, the debates and the negotiations surrounding the resolutions tend to focus on anti Semitism and racism against those of African descent. The UN Human Rights Council also called a special meeting to discuss the violence against those of African descent and African Americans after the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department. And so perhaps the UN should call a special meeting to discuss the rise in anti Asian hate around the globe to combat it at both the local level and at a high level when dealing with political leaders.
And actually, these attacks are not limited to the United States, but also around the world. A study in the United Kingdom found that 45.4% believe that China is responsible for the virus. 19.1% believe that Jews created the virus, and 19.1% believe that Muslims are spreading the virus. These statistics are interesting and also how different groups are being accused of spreading or creating the virus. The Human Rights Watch carried out a nationwide survey in Australia and found that there were 178 incidents of anti Asian hate in the first 2 weeks of April 2020. As we can see, different countries took different measures to tackle the rise in hate crimes and racist incidents. The UN has a unique challenge to combat racism across countries and cultures, and how a global institution positions itself in these conflicts can, as we discussed earlier, to be controversial. However, it is not only day to day citizens that commit these discriminations, but also the states themselves. The Anti Discrimination Center Memorial Brussels submitted a report documenting that at the onset of the pandemic, those of Chinese or Asian descent in Russia were subjected to discrimination at the hands of the state. Hotels, dormitories, and apartments were raided by the police to trace the virus, and in some cases, forced them to remain in quarantine regardless of when they had arrived in Russia. Additionally, a state owned public transportation company, Masgurants, instructed its employees to notify the police should they see any Chinese passengers on board, which quickly expanded to people from Central Asia as well.
And so clearly the COVID-19 pandemic helped provide foundation and justification for racists to carry out hate crimes more than before. And while anti-Asian sentiment was prevalent before the pandemic, it increased exponentially during this time. And as we see this, what is the UN's role in it? And how can they look to the future to better combat it as the world continues to evolve? To follow, we will present some policy proposals for the UN in its continued fight against contemporary forms of racism. The United Nations holds a special role in the fight against contemporary forms of racism. As a global institution, its role as an umbrella actor comes full force when dealing with these human rights issues and abuses. And in its current form, it operates in the capacity that it can, providing the platform for countries to discuss and unify under these issues, and also providing the necessary pushes for states to curate anti racist policies through the CERD. And so, what more can the organization do to evolve its policies to better combat racism? So, first, as we discussed earlier, the reporting to the CERD can sometimes be spotty or non existent. And so, moving forward, the UN should hold its state parties to the CERD accountable in submitting their reports timely. And even if they neglect to submit them at all, at least that is, pushing the states to evaluate their landscapes at home and their policies when it comes to racism and what they're currently doing to combat it. And it only encourages them to do even more than they're already doing now. Further, under the umbrella of the CERD, given that that is one of the main organs in the fight against racism, should be subcommittees that deal with the specific themes and other topics concerning racism. As we've discussed through this whole podcast, hate crimes and racist attacks can range from a variety of sources, from anti-Semitism to anti-Asian hate to xenophobia to anti-Black racism, etc. And each one of these areas is specific and are more prevalent in certain countries or regions than in others. And so subcommittees could help the UN focus its efforts more and help target areas where certain racist attacks take place more often.
Thank you so much for sharing those very important recommendations. Additionally, there have been meetings and concerns shared about the rise of violence against Asians or Asian descent. But the UN could do more in terms of collecting data about racist incidents and create a platform to try and avoid such incidents. As we discussed before, there are many racist incidents that go unnoticed and undocumented due to different reasons, such as fear, no means of documentation, such as cameras, social media, and absence of bystanders. Perhaps the UN could establish a sort of platform to collect such data and source a method to collect the data and testimonies, such as a cell phone app that is supported by the members of states. Through the app, people who are going through racism can share their story with the authorities and the UN. The app also should include emergency contacts of authorities who could be contacted directly if someone should need them, which could prevent incidents in the future. By creating this app and activating it globally with the support of governments, it could be a substantial source of collecting information about racist incidents, which could help the UN pressure specific countries or regions to come up with initiatives to make the situation better.
And overall, the combat against racism is an ever evolving one, which requires adaptability and open mindedness in how to combat it. In the age of digitization, there are methods that can be used to help support and streamline the UN in this and also help make the process more efficient. The fight against racism has been with us and will continue to be with us for years to come, but how we approach it and what we learn from it can better be adapted to make a larger impact. And that concludes our episode. We would like to thank you all for tuning in, and we hope that you were able to take something from this discussion that you didn't have before.
The UN's role in combating contemporary forms of racism is overarching, and the role it can feasibly play can be limited. However, by furthering discussion between member states, it can help nudge countries in the direction of curating anti racist policies and practices to help fight it.
Racism, xenophobia, neo-Nazism, and other contemporary forms of racism are longstanding and the results of systemic systems that help perpetuate the stigmas and abuses. Globally, the COVID-19 pandemic has shone a light on the rise of anti-Asian hate, police brutality against minorities, and much more. However, there is still hope, and a concerted effort to fight against it is necessary, and it is prevalent. As a civil society, the role we play in our day-to-day lives is crucial, so make sure you call out racism when you see it and stand up for those who may be more vulnerable than you. Together, we can put a stop to it and strive for the complete elimination of racial discrimination.
We thank you once again for your time and wish you a great day.
And with that, we have come to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to all of the listeners. We will be back with another discussion next week. Please don't forget to subscribe and share. And for the curious ones, visit us at Willy Brandt's Bulletin page for more episodes.